Good morning and welcome to the special called meeting of the Natchitoches Parish School Board. If you will please silence all of your cell phone devices, and we will stand for an invocation and a pledge of allegiance. Ms. Beverly, if you would be so kind to lead us in prayer, and Ms. Harvey, if you'll lead us in the pledge. Okay, thank you both. If we could now have our roll call.
Mr. Danzy. Mr. Matoire. Mr. Benefield. Mr. Garner.
Here.
Mr. Harris.
Present.
Mrs. Guidros. Mrs. Broadway.
Here.
Mrs. McGaskey. Ms. Palmer. Ms. Phelps.
Here.
And Ms. Harvey.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you so much. As everyone is aware, we have an old business item of COVID quarantine policy, and we also have a new business item after that, but we'll start with a COVID quarantine policy. Many of you are aware that the CDC changed their guidelines Thursday after our meeting. So that's what brings us here today. Dr. Eloy, if you would like to talk about these.
Yes, ma'am. So what I provided for y'all, and if Nurse Grivenberg, who is our COVID nurse, this weekend I asked her to put a policy together that's using the updated CDC guidance. What you have in your hands is that policy, and then also a draft letter that would go home. The big difference in the policy moving forward is that there is no longer a recommendation from the CDC to quarantine due to exposure, which is probably the largest departure from policy that they've had to this day. I can tell you, after talking to parents for the past 2 years, principals and students, this is a welcome sign from them. It's, as I've said every time, we evolve with the virus, and this is probably the largest jump ahead. I also talked to LDH, and if you look at these two things, you have two different issues here. One is a COVID positive case. If you're COVID positive, you still go home for 5 days. I think that's probably at this point understandable to everyone. When you come back from that from your positive case, you would still need to wear a mask for 5 days. The reasoning there, and I dug into this because I was like, well, you've already done your 5 days. It's because the incubation period is 3 to 7 days. I will tell you, if that's something y'all want to discuss and either keep or remove, we can have that discussion, because there is different information on how much help the mask would allow because of the different wearing of masks, and obviously we're not going to have people all wearing the surgical level, the N95 mask, correct? So that's for COVID positive case. You do your 5 days, and then 5 days of masking if y'all wanted to keep that. And then for exposure, we inform a parent your child has been exposed. We recommend to them that they might want to wear a mask. We also recommend that on the 5th day after exposure they want to get tested. But those are all recommendations. Nothing from the CDC at this point, because they are not an agency that mandates. Nothing is mandatory. We're not under the governor's emergency resolution. So that's what our suggestion is. I can tell you I also polled our principals, and the ones who responded to me, I believe it was about 7, are all very much in favor of moving towards this direction. I can also tell you they are even more in favor of not having masking upon return, even in the case of a positive case. And I'll tell you, there is some data to back up their position, and I have Nurse Grivenberg who can affirm this if she wants to come up to the lectern. Throughout this entire period, when we've quarantined students, and I think this is where parents have been upset, but we followed the LDH and CDC guidelines, the vast majority of students who have been quarantined due to exposure and we're talking about 90+% have never developed the virus. We have never seen, at least in Natchitoches, we have never seen high-level school transmission. We've seen community transmission where kids come in with it, but the quarantining on the whole was the safest measure, but it never resulted necessarily in students getting the disease once they were at home.
Not so much like the flu.
Correct. Not as much. Nurse Griffenberg, do you have anything to add to that?
There are some. I mean, that's with anything. The more closely you interact, there is a higher level that you're going to transmit it. So if you're on sports or things where you're in each other's faces a lot, but the majority of what we saw, at least last year, we've only been in school a week this year, was that it was not from in school. So if they're coming from a home positive where they have siblings or a parent, then yes, a lot of those showed up positive even after they'd been exposed, but not from in school.
And after talking to LDH, one of the things they said is this is an effort to move COVID and how we treat COVID from the pandemic stage to the endemic stage. Much like we deal with the flu, we'll have breakouts of flu, strep, things of that nature, mono. And so this is what they're talking about. It's not irresponsible. It's in line with CDC. It's just a different method because it is now becoming endemic instead of a pandemic.
Now, this first sheet, COVID-19 guidelines, update 8/15 of 22. It says cumulative, but it doesn't have the 24 hours in there. Is this something that we're going to have? If you see what I'm saying, it says 15 minutes cumulative, but it doesn't list the 24. In the letter, it does.
Yes, we can add within a 24-hour period. As y'all can imagine, the CDC were excited that they threw the curveball, but it was a bit of a curveball to pivot within a couple days, within 24 hours.
Yeah, I think this is probably what parents are looking for too. Keep them in school and minimize exposure.
And again, the majority of our kids that we put out for COVID last year were due to quarantines, not positives. And so we had, if you add up the number of hours, which I have not done, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of hours of missed instructional time due to quarantines. And as parents will tell you, quarantines for largely healthy students.
Madam President, if we're ready to make a motion, I'd like to make a motion to adopt
Okay.
this policy.
I'll second.
All right. We have a motion for Mr. Benefield, a second from Mr. Harris. Is there additional discussion at this time?
I do have one question. Did the board want to look into the masking for a positive case for days 6 through 10? Just a question. I'm not advocating either way. It's just a question for y'all.
Board members?
The guidelines based on CDC right now, nurse.
Yes, sir.
What?
Right
ma'am,
now-
I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Right now, the CDC hasn't changed anything in regards to the positive cases. It's been the same since they reduced it from a 10-day quarantine to a 5-day quarantine.
So the mask would kind of linger, the
They-
6 through 10.
They haven't changed that. So it remains for CDC that they recommend a 5-day quarantine and then 5 days mask.
And you explained that earlier because of the incubation period being anywhere between.
Between 3 and 7 days, typically, if you're going to show symptoms, it's going to be in that time frame. So they're saying that you're still potentially contagious up to and past the 5-day mark, especially if they're still showing some type of symptoms.
Which I do want to, so it sounds like the board is wanting to keep that, but we do have a policy in there, and I think this is to your point, previous meeting, Ms. Broadway. If a parent does not want to mask, then they are able to quarantine for the full 10 days
Right.
if they have a positive.
Right. If they do not want to mask their child, they would just have to keep them out a full 10 days. That's just in an effort to make sure that they're not spreading that they're not still contagious. They should not be post 5 days, but some people still show symptoms, and that's always explained too, that if you're still having fever, you have to be fever-free for at least 24 hours before you can return without Tylenol or Motrin. You have to have an improvement in your symptoms. So if they're showing continued same symptoms, they don't need to come back on day 6.
But this policy deals with the biggest reason we had children out of school.
Right.
Was the quarantine period.
So would there be a benefit, like,
for instance, if they are still showing some symptoms, like the runny nose, the cough, whatever, masking then, but maybe not if they're not showing symptoms? Is there any drawback to that, or do we not know?
I think it's going to be hard to manage that school to school because that's a wide variance. That's going to be hard for teachers to follow and principals to follow. I feel like once they get back to school, it's either they need to have the mask on or we don't, because that's going to be hard to differentiate.
Well, I think when we leave this table, we need to absolutely make sure it's 100% clear for parents. You know, we passed what we thought was pretty clear guidelines this past time, and it was not.
Yes.
So whatever we do, it really needs to be concrete and easy to understand.
I think in this situation, you're not having any quarantine for contacts, and that was the biggest, throughout this entire time, trying to figure out what that meant for close contact at home, close contact. It was this constant calculus. So I think that's going to really mitigate the misunderstandings and simplify everything. Because basically, you're only going to be quarantined if you test positive.
Essentially, based with this, with no masking, if you're exposed, you just notify the parent that, hey, your child was in close contact to somebody that tested positive. Please monitor them. If they develop symptoms, keep them home and get them checked out. But other than that, if you're positive, you'll do the quarantine just like before.
I think we need to follow CDC guidelines with the mask, because if we don't, then somebody catches with it, then we're gonna be liable for it. They're gonna be saying we're not following the guideline. And if we have problem with them, all we got to do is just tell the parents or whoever we following CDC guideline. Once they take it away, then we'll take it away. And that'll keep us out of court with, can't say, well, my child caught from different here, y'all didn't follow the guidelines and stuff. So I think we need to just leave it in there for the time being until they change it.
And I think we've been consistent with that. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any other discussion or questions?
No, I just want to say I'm in agreement that we need to just continue to follow CDC guidelines as we have previously.
Okay. Okay. All right, gang. So we have a motion by Mr. Benefield, a second by Mr. Harris. If we could have a roll call vote.
Mr. Danzy?
Yes.
Mr. Matoir?
Yes.
Mr. Benefield?
Yes.
Mr. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Broadway?
Yes.
Mrs. McGaskey?
Yes.
Ms. Palmer, Ms. Phelps?
Yes.
And Ms. Harvey?
Yes.
Motion passed.
Thank you. Item 3A, new business, Marco LLC letter of support.
Yes, ma'am. So Mr. Martin reached out to me last week. They are investing $9.5 million in their Chopin plant. And this, if y'all vote in the affirmative, this would allow me to write a letter of support for that endeavor. Large taxpayer in our parish. Also, I can tell you, Mr. Martin has been very important recently in supporting our CTE programs, specifically the Woodworks program. So I would be more than happy to sign this, but I did not want to do that unilaterally without board support.
I'll offer it.
I'll second.
So that's giving them a tax break on that
It-
9.5 million.
It's a letter of support for that effort, but for their ITEP application, yes, sir.
So the application would still come before the board once they
Correct.
get to that point. So this is just in support of their application.
Correct.
Okay. We have a motion by Mr. Garner, a second by Mrs. Broadway. Any other questions? Okay, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Danzy?
Yes.
Mr. Matoir?
Yes.
Mr. Benefield?
Yes.
Mr. Garner?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mrs. Broadway?
Yes.
Mrs. McGaskey?
Yes.
Ms. Phelps?
Yes.
And Ms. Harvey?
Yes.
Motion passed.
Okay, is there any other business to come before the board?
I got about 4 other things I want to add.
No. No, I'm kidding. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
Okay, second?
Yeah.